My name is Cindy Blackstock. I am a member of the Gitxsan Nation up in northern British Columbia, and I am the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. Everyone calls us Caring Society for short, so use that. And I'm a professor at McGill University. We're at the graveside of Nicholas Fudd Davin. He was a member of Parliament, and John A. Macdonald, the first Prime Minister of Canada, sent him down to Carlisle Industrial School in Pennsylvania. They were running there one of the earliest Native American boarding schools, which were really re-education camps. Davin documented what was happening in terms of assimilating the kids down there, and he comes back with the Davin Report, which was the birth certificate of residential schools in Canada. So he's buried here at Beechwood as one of the many actors who are alive in residential schools and here teaching Canadians about how to do better. It was actually Carlisle Industrial School in the United States in Pennsylvania. John A. Macdonald, upon the founding of the country, was really seeking an Aryan state. Even if you look at records of that time, the man was considered to be racist. He would use the term Aryan, and that's why he would persecute so strongly members of the Chinese community along with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. He heard about these industrial schools that were being used to kind of house and re-educate and eradicate the culture of Native Americans. And so he sent down a guy who's buried here in the cemetery, Nicholas Fudd Davin, to do what's called the Davin Report. Now, Nicholas Fudd Davin returns with a report with recommending that these things be rolled out, and John A. Macdonald immediately thinks this is a good idea, and that is a source of them. Now, interestingly, the Carlisle Industrial School was headed up by a man named Pratt, General Pratt. His background was that he was in charge of military prisons. So when we think about how the residential schools were structured, the segregation of children by gender, the rigid schedules, the servitude and rigorous manual labor that would exhaust the children, the poor dietary requirements, all of that was something that he likely ported in from his military prison career. And so that's what really was the skeleton, if you like, of the residential school system in Canada. And it continued, of course, until 1996. You know, we know that the government of Canada, throughout the over 100 years they were operating, all of the politicians, all of the bureaucrats were complicit in this. They were actively making choices to operate these things. And then we have the churches. The idea was that the re-education, I call them almost re-education camps, the re-education of these children was to displace their identity as First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children and supplant it with a Christian Western identity. And that's where the churches came in. The churches were deployed to run these. Over 60% of them were run by the Catholic Church, but the Anglican Church, the United Church, and others, Presbyterian churches, those were all involved in the rollout of residential schools. And then we have the public. And this is something that people, I think, are not yet fully coming to terms with, is that people of that period knew the children were dying preventatively, knew it was wrong, and yet did not act out in sufficient numbers to save their lives. I think that when one of the propaganda pieces of the Canadian state, in order to justify the inhumane treatment and the violation of all kinds of rights for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children and their families, it was to really create this savage and civilized dichotomy that underlies colonialism, where Indigenous peoples were savage and everything everyone else did was better. And that allowed for a normalization of racism as a founding principle of Canada. People were born generation after generation into racism, and many people received no education about First Nations, Métis, or Inuit people other than government-fed stereotypes, like they can't manage their money, it's, they're just growing up to be drunks, and all of this other stuff. And that served to kind of take the public's gaze away from what was clearly, even in 1908, one of the lawyers thought was close to manslaughter, in that Canada refused to implement the life-saving reforms of Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, who's buried here at Beechwood. You know, survivors had told the stories through their tears about the children unmarked graves. They knew that they were there because some of them had to dig the graves of those children. People like Dr. Bryce, that we'll talk about, knew that those children were there. The government knew they were there. The churches knew that they were there. The TRC spends a lot of time talking about these children unmarked graves. There's over 100 cemeteries. Imagine that. Imagine sending your child, having your child forcefully removed from you and sent to a school where you have to walk by a graveyard to get to the front entrance. There's over 100 of these. And those were the known graves. That doesn't speak to the many children who died just horrifically. They would try to dispose of the body by throwing the child into a water, like a lake or something, or else they would throw them into a lumber incinerator, things like this. But for whatever reason, no one could hear it yet. And so often the narrative was, but Canada is such a good country. And that's true, and especially for people who have come from other forms of persecution, there's a sense of wanting to not believe that the horrors that you fled are also being perpetrated in some form here. And I think the opportunity is to create allies out of those folks, is to say we have to defeat this hate and racism and discrimination of all forms that plague societies around the world. And that means embracing Canada's truth and learning from it. This is the graveside of Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce. He was the Chief Medical Health Inspector for the Indian Department and the President of the American Public Health Association. In 1907, he blew the whistle on the preventable causes of death of children in residential schools, dying at a rate of over 50% over 3 years. The cause, unequal health care funding and terrible health practices. He went to Prime Minister Laurier and Duncan Campbell Scott to say, fix the system, save the children's lives. They refused. But his story was covered by national headlines. And one of the people reading it, a guy named Lawyer Blake, he said, in that Canada fails to prevent the causes of death, it brings itself into unpleasant nearness with the charge of manslaughter. They were really, in many cases, right in plain sight. That's the thing. People think that they were off in far-flung places, and in some cases that's true. But if we take to Kamloops, the Kamloops Indian Residential School sits right in the middle of the city, and others were as well. They would bring children in from different places and try to locate these schools far enough so that the children couldn't run away and run home. But that didn't mean that they weren't around non-Indigenous folks. And this is the story we need to confront ourselves with, is that these things would unfold in plain sight. And it wasn't that people didn't know what was happening. There are newspaper articles, for example, in the 70s and 80s about children running away from the schools and freezing to death. And people coming out upon them and being alarmed and horrified that these children were dying, because it was quite evident that they were also, they were full of bruises and all the rest of it. There would be an outcry in the community, but then the headline would die and the children would too.
E mi unisco ai fratelli vescovi canadesi nel chiedervi scusa.
The victims had to travel to the house of the wrongdoer to ask for an apology. And then the narrative was about the healing of the victims. That narrative foists the work back onto the victims. We need to be talking the justice narrative, because that's where apologies find meaning. Why was it that they had to go all that way when there were so many children in the grounds of unmarked grazing that the Catholics were running? Why wasn't the Pope on the first plane over here? Even in the middle of the pandemic, we're in outdoor spaces, you can stand 50 feet away, do your apology with a microphone. But more than that, they have to take seriously their obligations to reform the church and make reparations. And what that looks like is they have to have an independent, credible people going into the records of the Vatican and also of the Holy See. Keep in mind that the Vatican, the Catholic Church, is both a country and a church. And we know from other scandals that they smuggled records out under diplomatic pouch. So we have to see that verification that there are no records in the Vatican. I think that I find that very hard to believe. And that they disclose all the records in Canada. Second, that they as a church pay the reparations. What they're asking for here is their parishioners to do it. Well, the church has a lot of assets that it's taken, frankly, from First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. It should be liquidating those assets for the purposes of reparations. And then we need to see reform within the church. And this is a global phenomenon. The church has got a horrible track record of sexually abusing and harming children. There needs to be serious reform in there. So in the papal apology, although I respect the Pope for at least engaging with it on an intellectual level, I find that apology doesn't have much meaning because apologies are in actions, they're not just in words. Too often these apologies have been to excuse the wrongdoing of the wrongdoer and get the public to look elsewhere. Like if you were responsible, even if you're a part of an organization that was responsible for children dying in such horrible ways, alone and away from their families, and in fact being taught to be ashamed of those families, wouldn't you move heaven and earth to get over here and do whatever you could to make it right and to own that and to offer that apology? Why is it that people had to go over to the Atlantic and do that? That to me is a serious question. You know, there's two ways to think of survivors, and I think the one place that we never look is the survivors in the government. Like, what did the government actually learn from residential schools, and how did that change its behavior? That is a question I'm obsessed with, because we're part of a collective of First Nations right now that have been litigating against Canada for 16 years to get equal services for First Nations kids so they don't go in child welfare at 17 times the rate. And we've had to fight Canada tooth and nail. These are the grandchildren of the residential school survivors, and they're fighting to give them less. So I think when we talk about survivors, we have to look at that side of the equation too, because that's where the justice piece has to be accounted. What have they done? What supports have been put in place? What accountability? What would a new bureaucrat walking into the government of Canada learn today that was different than the ones that came before them? And then for those who were in the schools and their descendants, I think it's really important to acknowledge the generational strength that they passed down to us. Sometimes we talk about them as broken people, or that all of us have to heal. But the multi-generational strength they passed down when they were children in those schools, trying to remember just a couple words of the language, and they would say it to themselves at night when no one was listening so that maybe one day they could pass it down to their own kids. We're the beneficiaries of that. So when I think of those children in residential schools, I am one of Thanksgiving is my first piece. And the second is to honor that there is real trauma, that was post-traumatic stress, introduction of sexual abuse, etc. And those are real issues that we have to embrace in our communities. Self-government isn't something you sign on a paper. It's when you embrace what hurts, is what my friend Terry Cross has always said. So what we need is we are in this mess with people with multi-generational trauma who have had to turn to addictions, etc. Not of our own making, but we have a direct interest in fixing that. And that means we need the equitable and culturally based resources for multi-generational trauma, for addictions. There needs to be serious and meaningful discussions and change actions regarding lands and resources so people could live with dignity and sustainably on the lands they've lived on for thousands of years. So these are the types of things we need going forward. I think that there's still more work to do. I think the fact that children are being taught about residential schools in school is really good. I'm concerned about jurisdictions like Alberta that continue to want to just, whitewash, frankly, the curriculum and not teach children and young people about Canada's true history. But I do see an opportunity for us to calibrate and you'll never understand what it was like to be in one of those schools. But most of us have children in our lives. And imagine if someone, just because of who you were, something that you couldn't change about yourself, they would take your child away at the age of 5. If you resisted, the RCMP or other law enforcement could throw you into jail, and they would take your younger children too. Your child would be taught to be ashamed of everything that you value in your life. Those teachings maybe that are sacred to your family. They would be told that from the day they arrive, they have to speak a different language. They have to believe in a different God. That their brother or sister, or brother, who maybe it's a girl and her brother is in the other part of the school and they can't even wave at each other. And then we set in with the abuse and the neglect. And more of them would die in those schools than a soldier would in the Second World War. The chances of dying were higher. It doesn't take much for Canadians to understand the gravity of what happened here. Now the question is, it's not helpful for us if you just stay blamed there and feel ashamed. What we have to do is say, okay, this was terribly wrong, and the reason it happened is because too many of us fell asleep on the switch. We're seeing on our television screens murdered, missing Indigenous women. There's a report there with solutions to fix that problem. Let's get on that and do it. That's the way forward.
Today is Orange Shirt Day. Underneath all of these levels of sweaters that I have on is my orange shirt. But today is also the inaugural day of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. So this is a day to honor the survivors, the intergenerational survivors, and the victims of these institutions of assimilation and genocide.
Right. Well, this is a day to really honor the survivors of residential schools and children who went there, but also those who did not make it out, who died there. And the way you do that is you learn about residential schools. You look at some of the great free learning materials that are out there for all of us. For example, you can go on the National Film Board's website and you could watch Eleniso Bomsawin's films free of charge with you and your family. Have a movie night that night. Maybe get a movie week and learn about the wonderful, rich, and diverse histories of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, but also some of the ongoing injustices. Go onto our website, fnCaringSociety.com. Go to Spirit Bear's page and you'll see a book that we wrote here about Beechwood Cemetery, about the people who are involved in residential schools. Dr. Bryce, who raised the alarm and said you could save the kids' lives. Duncan Campbell Scott, the bureaucrat who's buried just a few meters from here, who said, no, we're not going to do it. And Nicholas Swud Davin's buried here. You could learn about that together and then link at how that relates to the contemporary human rights challenge that we have for First Nations kids today. There's so many things that you can do that day, but I would say that learning is not enough, caring is not enough. You have to do something. So even if all you do is get a copy of the TRC calls to action and you read them yourself, but then you take that extra step and you send them to your elected officials and you say, wake up call, next election, I'm going to be asking you about this. That will help.
I'm Nick McCarthy. I'm the Director of Marketing, Communications, and Community Outreach for Beechwood Cemetery. I'm a settler and Roman Catholic background. So our Reconciling History program is probably one of our signature pieces thanks to our relationship and our partnership. I think it allows us to really sort of frame not only the National Cemetery, but frame the missing part of our own history. I think when people discover this at Beechwood, again, thanks to all the work we've done in the last 7 years, it really allowed us to sort of open up people's eyes and hopefully garner some attention to both reconciliation and missing and murder Aboriginal women, as well as the residential school. This learning is constant, and as we discover, or as we rediscover, because again, that's what we've been talking about, rediscovering history, we get more and more people talking about it. But as you said, the headlines need to keep people aware, but people need to move beyond the headlines.
Yeah.
So what we're looking at is very much of the period, right? It's the Victorian era grave. Duncan Campbell Scott lost his daughter as well as his wife before he passed away. And this is really where our entire Reconciling History program actually started. As Cindy alluded to earlier, this is the birthplace of how we rediscovered history and shared that history. The one thing about Duncan Campbell Scott is that by the time he passed away, there's no one left to write his dates. So there's no record on his monument of his passing, his birth. It's only his children. And we often sort of like to remind people that his daughter died overseas at a school, a boarding school overseas, a very reputable one, but she died of very much the same illnesses that Indigenous children were dying of. And so we don't understand how there wasn't that connection between Scott and what was happening in the schools that he himself managed, or mismanaged really is the key, and bringing back his daughter to be buried here. And you look at it, it's 1907, like this is really early on within the residential school program, and we knew what was going on at that point. You had great people like Dr. Peter and Bryce who were sounding the alarm, but here he buries his daughter and doesn't see the correlation between the same illnesses.
We erected the historical plaque for Dr. Bryce, along with the Bryce family. But there was already one here for Duncan Campbell Scott, and it was glowing, you know, and no mention of residential schools. And I tell Nick honestly, like I thought this was going to be a fight, right? I thought, you know, because how hard is it going to be to try and correct this? And it wasn't about erasing his contributions. I recognize that there are other people who think his poetry is quite good. But it is about giving weight to his legacies. If we think about what would Canadian society be today if Duncan Campbell Scott had not written a poem? There might be a few people upset, but not many. But what would be the weight if Duncan Campbell Scott would have actually said yes to Dr. Bryce's reforms? Yeah, but you know what we know from John Malloy's book, and I recommend it to all of your viewers. It's called A National Crime. It takes its title from Dr. Bryce's report. And it tells the story of residential schools from Canada's own documents. And what we see from reading that historical record is that there were people of all walks of life after Bryce and before him who were raising the alarms. And there was active resistance by First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples as well that was known to the public. And yet that's where this slumber comes in, where we don't we're not awakened to the real horror that we're reading about and activated as maybe we would be if it was to deal with another population of people. Not feeling positive means that change won't happen. And I've seen it. I've seen it happen. And I've particularly seen it what happens when you trust children with the truth. When we teach children about residential schools, they showed up in these courtrooms, they filled the tribunal room, and they understood implicitly, this isn't all right. And yeah, it doesn't feel good to know that First Nations kids are getting less because they're First Nations. But what we can feel joyful about is the opportunity we have to join hands and implement the solutions that are on the books to fix that. So let's do that part of the work, right? Well, my message to Canadians is, when you see an injustice, don't turn the page, because when the story dies, the children do too. Number two, there's things that you can do that are completely free. Doesn't take it takes very little time. And that is just showing that you care about the solutions that are already on the books that governments are choosing not to implement. The third thing that is also really important is to make sure we're holding governments accountable and churches accountable for reforming themselves so that they don't perpetrate this kind of harm on anybody else into the future. Those are really the ways to really honor the residential school survivors. When I heard their testimonies, just almost down to a person, they said, please don't let this happen again. That's why I'm telling you what the truth is here. We owe it to them to listen and then to honor their wishes.